In the next video, we'll be taking a detailed look at Redshift's render view, and we'll be talking about color spaces a bit. But first, let's install the OpenColorIO ACES configurations. Now, Redshift comes with its own ACES configurations, but those configs won't necessarily be available to other applications that we'll be working in. For example, here's a render that I've pulled into Fusion, and this doesn't look quite right. And we have some viewer color space controls that we can set here to make this better. And we can turn on the OCIO color space view LUT here. And if we go to edit that, we can select from a few different color spaces here. Perhaps we want to read this in linear and output it in 709, but I don't think this is quite right. This linear color space, the old school linear color space that is, isn't the same as the ACES CG space that Redshift renders in. Now, Redshift changed this in a recent version. Previously, all of their core rendering computation was done in standard linear space, but they moved to ACES CG space, and we need to make sure that we can properly support that in our other applications. Now, to install the OpenColorIO configs for ACES support, you can go to opencolorio.org and go to the downloads, and under sample OCIO configurations, we can just save this zip file here. And then once you save that zip and open it up, you'll see this comes with a few different versions of these ACES definitions. So we can just grab the most recent version and we can copy that anywhere on disk. I've just copied mine to C/ACES. And then we can set an environment variable so that these configurations are recognized by our various programs like Fusion and Houdini. Then we can set our environment variables so that these OCIO configs are automatically loaded in our other programs like Fusion and Houdini. So we can go to Edit, our System Environment Variables button, and then we'll create a new one, and we'll call this OCIO, and we can hit Browse File, and this is already pointing to the right location. Go inside ACES 103 in this case, and select config.ocio, and hit OK, and OK again. And you could also specify this in Houdini's env file. In some setups that you might see online, you'll see people specifying that same exact environment variable in this houdini.env, but that's really not necessary if you've set it at the system level because Houdini will see that. Now I'm going to open up both Houdini and Fusion again, and we can verify that these configurations are loaded and available. So in Fusion, we actually can't select a view LUT without having a render loaded. So I'll just grab one of my render stills, and a quick Fusion tip here: if you drag in this render like this, then it's going to try to read it as an image sequence. And you'll see it only exists for, actually it looks like a few frames. It's trying to stack up multiple renders as a sequence. And you can load this in as a still image by holding Shift as you drag this into Fusion here. Let go of Shift after you drop it, and now it's a still image. It exists for the whole timeline. And now that we have a render loaded up here, we can select our OCIO color space view LUT and go to edit that. And you can see we now have a whole bunch of source and output spaces available. So for the source space, let's select ACES CG because that's what Redshift is going to be rendering in by default now. And for the output space, we'll select Output Rec 709 because this is typically the most fitting format for most deliveries and standard computer monitors that you'll be working on. And I'm using Fusion Studio here, which is a paid program, but you can also do your compositing for free in the Fusion page in DaVinci Resolve, which is free, and these color LUT controls should be the same in Resolve as well. Now on the Houdini side, we can go to Edit and go to the Color Settings option and the Color Correction tab, and you can see that this is automatically pulling in this OCIO config based on that environment variable that we've set. So that's all working fine. And if you go to your render view, you can also see in this little drop down at the bottom of the render view here, you have these options for control over your color space transforms here as well. Although, we're working in Redshift primarily in this class, so we'll just be doing that sort of stuff in the Redshift render view, but I just wanted to point it out in Houdini's own native render view as well. Now, if you set up these ACES configs after starting a project, you might run into some issues. So you can see here, after reopening the scene that we've already been working on and rerunning this render, we're getting a much darker looking result in our render view, and we're also getting this warning in our logs here that indicate that it's failed to get this ACES CG processor from the OpenColorIO config. And if you want to get a closer look at some of the messages that are popping up, you can click on this to open up this UI here. And this display is a little bit weird because I've increased my UI scale for screen recording, but you can get a better look at the log instead of this tiny little window down here by going to File, Open Log, and this will open up the Redshift render logs in your browser here. So you can get a better look at all of the things that it's doing, and its warnings and errors will be indicated pretty clearly. Now, Redshift stores its color configurations on the cameras. And if you take a look at the camera itself that we're rendering here, we go to our render cam wide, and then go to OCIO/post effects. You can see under the color management here, this is showing the display as ACES, and the OCIO views are just set to none. There are no options available there. But if we create a new camera, like so, go to the Redshift camera tab, go to OCIO/post effects, you can see now we have a whole bunch of different view options available. And you can also see this problem here in the render view settings, and I'm doing another video after this where we dive into a few more of the render view options, but if you go to the gear setting here, this brings up your color management options as well, and you can see that this also mirrors what we see on the camera. We see the ACES display available and nothing available under view, and that's not normal, that's not how it should be. And thankfully, there's a pretty quick fix for this, but that fix is not very obvious. So let's stop the render, minimize that render view, and get rid of this cam 1 that we don't need anymore. And on the render cam wide, where we have those missing OCIO view options, we can tell Houdini to rebuild these parameters. Now, I believe earlier I may have talked about this object parameters button on the Redshift shelf here that will add the Redshift object parameters to geometry objects that might not have them if you perhaps started building a scene before installing Redshift. Then some of these geometry objects might be missing that Redshift tab, and there's an equivalent thing for camera parameters as well. And we can use that cam params button to rebuild these. So let's go to our edit parameter interface on that camera, and then scroll down to, we've got the Redshift camera here, and down to OCIO/post effects, and I will delete these parameters related to OCIO color management and accept that, and you can see those parameters have disappeared from our camera here, and you can restore those just by going to that Redshift shelf and making sure that camera's selected and hitting the cam params button. And then if we go back to OCIO/post effects, we now have this OCIO view dropdown with all of the options available. And hitting that camera parameters button will also preserve all of your other parameters as they are. So just to illustrate this, if I make a copy of my render camera here, and if we perhaps just change a bunch of things on all of the tabs under the Redshift camera settings here, like so, just changing them randomly. And then once again, I'll go back to Edit Parameter Interface, delete these OCIO color management parameters here, and accept that. You can see those have disappeared, and we still have all of these changed settings on those other tabs. And now when we hit the camera parameters shelf tool, you can see that's rebuilt those missing parameters, but it hasn't overwritten anything else. So thankfully that button does preserve any other changes that you may have made. Now we can delete that duplicated camera, we don't need that anymore, and bring our render view back up, and let's re-render this scene after fixing that render cam. And you can see now this is showing up much brighter, and this has all of these view options available in this drop down here. It's defaulting to sRGB, but you may want to set your viewer to Rec 709, as this is the most common standard for working on most standard computer monitors and delivery formats. And you'll also notice that when you change the settings in the render view here, if you go back to the camera, it's changing that OCIO view setting on this camera parameter. So these two things are linked to each other. So if I change this back to Rec 709, it changes on the camera and vice versa. So what you see in this render view here is really just mimicking that parameter for the current render. So now we've set up the ACES configs for Redshift and Houdini and Fusion, and probably some other programs as well that will recognize that system OCIO environment variable. And there's one more thing I'd like to point out before finishing up this video. And if we go to the out context and the Redshift ROP here, go to the Redshift tab and System and scroll down, and you can see you have this rendering space parameter here, and I'm seeing ACES CG as the only option for the rendering space that the render core works in. So we can't really select anything else here, but it's worth pointing this out as an indication of what space you're rendering in. So when you were using older versions of Redshift, you might see a different option here on some legacy scenes that you may have created before. So sure enough, this is what we would expect to see. And if we open up our settings again and look at our display options, you can see this now has the correct view options available under this drop down here. Now with the default ASUS configs that ship with Redshift, you wouldn't have quite as many configurations here. It's a more limited set that you have available. And as I mentioned before, for most purposes, you'll probably want to use Rec 709 for your display view here. And now we have our ASUS configs set up correctly in Redshift and Houdini and Fusion and etc. And we can move forward with tweaking our lighting and shading and everything now that we're working in the correct color spaces.